Hi, everybody. What financial ratios are most important to value and convexity investors? There are a lot of them. Okay, welcome back. It's Brian Foote reminding you to subscribe and get ready because our courses are launching, and I'd like you on board because in the next 3 to 4 minutes, I can't possibly cover the financial ratios that are most important, but I'll give you a couple. Right? Everybody has a different flavor. That's the beauty of investing, is that it's filled with quantitative measures, ratios, and measures, but each practitioner has a different subset. It certainly can be likened to art, painting, or cooking. Right? You've got different ingredients. We're all trying to make a hamburger here, but we all have different special techniques. But back to investing and away from food. Ultimately, I think there's two that you should hone in on. If you had only two in your toolkit to get started, I would look at return on invested capital and free cash flow to equity. You put them together, and with these two tools, you can understand a major piece of what you need to know. Right? It's almost like every other tool that you'll work with in coming up with the financial analysis of a company can be derived from or can generate these two: return on invested capital, free cash flow to equity, and it hits all three financial statements in each of those. So what's return on invested capital? First of all, it's the profitability generated by all the sources of capital that have been put into the business. So it's an indicator of what the management's quality of capital allocation is, right? They take in debt capital, that they borrow money. In the short run, there's working capital that's been put to work, and in the long run, or in the infinite term, there's equity, right? They've sold pieces of the company to raise capital, and that's more permanent than debt. So that's invested capital. Return on invested capital, net operating profit after tax is the return. So that's your net operating profit less the tax that you paid during the year. And invested capital is market value, is not market value, I'm sorry. It's the debt plus equity. It's the book value of the debt plus the book value of the equity. You want your return on invested capital intuitively to be higher than the weighted average cost of capital. What does that mean? Well, if you've borrowed money, if the company's fully financed by debt, it's only borrowings, and you're paying 8% to rent that money, you want to be generating better than 8% return on invested capital. So your net operating profit after tax divided by that book value of debt better be greater than 8%. Why is that? Well, because you won't be able to service your debt, right? So that's pretty simple. But the weighted average cost of capital is when you have equity out there. So there's that value of debt, paying 8% on it, let's say, and then there's the value of equity, right? You financed your company with both. The equity also needs to be served, right? It may not have an explicit dividend, but your cost of equity is probably, or almost always, you can find me examples of where this isn't the case, but your cost of equity is higher than your cost of debt, but really by definition, right? So let's say your cost of equity is 15%. Your cost of debt is 5%. You blend these two, and it's 50-50, debt, equity. You blend these two things together, you get 10%. So you're going to want your return on invested capital to be greater than 10%, or the company is actually consuming capital, right? So this tells you a lot of things, right? You can look at a company and say, all right, their cost of equity is 15%. I've derived that. They've got 5% debt out there. So this business must be earning 10% on that capital before it's an attractive business, right? If it's earning just that, then basically they've allocated capital just to service those two things. But you get a sense in looking at the income statement how they derive that net income after taxes, right? They have to pay out all of those expenses with the revenues before they see a profit, and then they've got to pay the tax authorities. And then they've got to justify the business both to the debt holders, right? The debt holders want that interest rate, and the equity holders, your cost of equity is really the cost that you would want to, the return you would want to get from equity. Just think about it simply there. The second measure after return on invested capital that we want to examine and that I would use as the second piece of the toolkit would be free cash flow, right? So we've calculated NOPAT, net operating profit after tax, right? That's an income statement derived thing. Free cash flow is actually the ultimate measure of the earnings a company can create. This is the true cash flow, not EBITDA. Get that out of your mind. This takes into account cash operating income, right? All the cash income that's generated by the company after the revenue comes in the door on a cash basis and all of the cash expenses are taken care of, then you subtract out the cap. So you have operating cash flow, right? The operating cash flow from your cash flow statement also takes into account movements in working capital, right? So how much inventory needs to be bought into the business, how many receivables are collected, how many payables have to be paid out. Those things are all taken into account. So the short run cash needs of the business, as well as over the course of the year, the cash income, all of those roll into, on the cash flow statement, your cash from operations, right? So it starts with income, and then there's a bunch of add backs. Then you subtract out the CapEx that's required to maintain the company's assets. What's that called is maintenance CapEx. Subtract you have operating cash flow here, you have CapEx here. The difference is free cash flow. That's actually, in my mind, superior to NOPAT in assessing the profitability of a company. The reason is that you actually see whether or not at the end of the year, the company, after taking care of the capital expenditures that are needed to maintain that business, that there's actually cash left over, right? If you owned a private company or a piece of a private company, nobody could report to you EBITDA or NOPAT and then tell you, oh, I'm putting the EBITDA in your bank account, Mr. Investor, or hey Dad, I've just generated a lot of NOPAT. They want to see free cash flow, right? Because the next question that an operator of a private business would ask is, that EBITDA sounds really nice, but how much can I put in the bank after making appropriate repairs to my equipment and painting the fence or whatever needs to be done on an annual basis? Anyway, return on invested capital, free cash flow to equity. You put those two tools together, you'll have a lot to work with, and you can analyze almost every type of company that comes your way. Financials are a different subset. I'm talking banks, insurance companies, etc. But with these two tools, you can take a pretty good slug at many companies within the universe. Thanks for joining.